Good morning, Catamounts. I am Kathy Tremblay, a graduate of the UVM class of 1985 and Vice President of the UVM Alumni Association. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our Alumni Weekend author-led book discussion with award-winning poet and UVM faculty member, Major Jackson. Major Jackson is the author of 5 books of poetry, including The Absurd Man, which was published this year, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn, which won the Cave Canem Poetry Prize for a first book of poems. He is also the editor of Library of America's County Cullen Collected Poems. Professor Jackson has been recognized with numerous awards and fellowships from organizations including the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, the Whiting Foundation, the Cave Canem Foundation, and the Witter-Binner Foundation. He currently serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. Professor Jackson has published his poems and essays widely, including in American Poetry Review, The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, Paris Review, and Poetry Magazine. His work has also been included in multiple volumes of Best American Poetry. At the University of Vermont, Major Jackson is the Richard A. Dennis Green and Gold Professor of English and a University Distinguished Professor. And now, I'd like to invite Professor Jackson to read a few of his poems from his latest book, The Absurd Man. Professor?
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to the UVM Alumni Association for inviting me to be a part of Alumni Weekend 2020. I would first like to read some poems from my newest book, The Absurd Man. Thank you for that introduction. And I'll read 2 new poems to end in this portion. I would first like to start with a poem called My Children's Inheritance, which often when we think of inheritance, we think of financial. But of course, we also leave behind memories, but maybe more importantly, human values. My children's inheritance. A fancy for high green hills by a sea, baggy spaces in the day, a knack for gunpowder thinking, a library humming like a swarm of gnats, the intrigue of a woman with a pitch-perfect mind, blinking eyes whose silence is ancient and naked, a grave that is not a grave but a ruin to visit in middle age, a chifforobe of half-empty cologne bottles in various colors, and dried flowers, more dignified in death, both evidence that I once cherished bouquets and timelessness. Bullet casings, a bowl of seashells, fine pens, one the Aurora Diamante with its 2-toned rhodium plating that glitters when my right hand rages toward heaven. A love of big plates of pasta, Argentinian folk music, African rainforests, and the speeches of Lincoln that miss the pages of my books more than my doorways. A habit of dancing when the needle drops its existential beats. A disregard for the enemies of linnets and macaws. Fears that match the hawk-haunted buttes out west. A hard desire for justice. The habit of lip biting when trouble nears. The way my mouth opens like a flower. My quiver of arrows that outweighs the world, leaving the animals to bear witness. Memories of laughter that was bread and water. Stylish hats, ways to time travel, the consequences of mistakes and second thoughts gummed to the future. A collection of radios, stacks of vinyl, the limitations of secrets, long nights that cascade like waterfalls, my madness granular and complex, sealed like a footfall. This next poem, titled Double Major, is a self-reflexive poem. I utterly believe Walt Whitman when he says we contain multitudes, and the great political, um, uh, uh, Afro-American political leader in the early 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois said that African Americans contain double consciousness, which became the foundation for a number of Americans to think about many aspects of themselves. Inspired by a poet, the Argentinian poet and essayist and fiction writer Borges, who wrote a poem called Borges and I decided to empower one of those cells to speak about the aspects of major that is the more public major. So this is my inner self speaking about the poet you see in front of you. Double major, and that's a pun, as you know. Major. I emerge whenever he confuses the lamp for a moon. It is then he thinks of fine bindings in ordered Athenaeums. I own his face, but he watches and spends too little time behind his ears. He sees me in the mirror behind thick clouds of shaving cream, then suddenly believes in ghosts. His other selves are murals in the cave of his mind. They are speechless, yet large. They steer his wishes like summer rain and amplify his terrors like newscasters. What he doesn't know, his dreams are his father's dreams, which are his grandfather's dreams, and so on. They possessed a single wish. He knocks repeatedly on the bolted door to his imagination. Tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with his poetry, and thus I am his most loyal critic. He trots me out like a police dog. He calls out thirst for pads and pencils, destiny. Our voices come together like two wings of a butterfly. On occasion, he closes his eyes and sees me. I am negative capability, the test to all men are created equal. We are likely to dance at weddings against my will. He pulled out the same moves writing this poem, a smooth shimmy and a hop. This page is a kind of looking glass, making strange whatever stone carvings he installed along the narrow road to his interior. I suffer in silence, wedded to his convictions. He would like to tell you the truth about love, but we are going to bed, to bed. So in this book, The Absurd Man, there are a number of poems that are inspired by the landscape of Vermont, but also the seasons. Autumn appears, summer appears, and soon it will be winter. The title of this poem is called Winter. The boughs have been naked for weeks. Snowplows scrape the highway clean of its sugar. People withdraw into their nests and study the language of fire. A group of high school girls on their way home in the afternoon dark falls into an embankment and flaps their arms and legs as though cloud swimming toward the coming world. The blank silence of dead earth forces us to gaze up, harvest the black music that belongs to all the eyes in the future, who will turn to the spheres and study too, whatever light to fill their emptiness. In this book, my grandfather appears twice. My grandfather, who was born at the end of World War I, was exercised a different kind of masculinity, and I found myself unwittingly contemplating what I inherited from him. He was a construction worker. He worked for Grace Kelly's father in Philadelphia as a brick worker. And yet he was also a gentleman, a person who came home with all kinds of dust on him, but shower and then dress like he was going to a ballroom somewhere. Anyway, my grandfather he was a quiet man, but occasionally after a beer or two, he had these life lessons that he wanted to pass on to me. A grandfather's lecture. If punched, you punch twice as hard. And in the face, a whop right in the nose. Use the flat counter of your fist or the palm's hard ridge. Lean into it, but brace your stroke with your back leg, then lift your whole blow into his mug. He'll crumble. If you're lucky, blood will pour in rivulets down his mouth and chin, leaving him startled, dazed like the newly awakened. Don't relent. Think what he'd do to you if given the chance. Throw what we used to call a haymaker. Nest fear inside, but don't tremble. Don't parade and prance like you're Ali. Don't hesitate. Land a jawbreaker, jab him in the gut. Did you know that the brown bomber never televised a hit, never reared back, just snuggled in, leaned close, shoulder to shoulder, calmer than most, and kapow to his ribs. Schmeling struggled on the ropes. Life's no boxing ring, but know your power, what your shadow is made. Then always make up. Show your adversary you've got class. Don't tower over him. That's for punks. Extend a hand, help him up. I thought of my grandfather. A lot of poems are exaggerations. I should say that too. Most people think poems are a transcription, but really often they're made up. The most beautiful man never performs hard labor. I am sure my grandfather would be ashamed of my hands, for they carry nothing and are soft as downy feathers. And I am sure he'd look askance at my treasured collection of stemless wine glasses and fashionable ascots. I am sure he'd smirk at the sight of fresh cut flowers delivered at my door Tuesday afternoons, when my silken thoughts make like schools of minnows, and so too the cantatas filling my house, and me paddling like a dog through the recitatives, so unaccustomed my hands to the shape and feel of a revolver or the wood shaving tools he kept in his tool belt like armaments. I am sure he'd shake his head at my having paused beneath a fruit tree on a bicycle with a basket carrying a French baguette and a collection of Lorca's poetry, angling for a woman's touch. The title of this poem is In the 80s, We Did the Walk. If you end your crusades for the great race, then I will end my reenactments of flying. And if you lean down to smell a painted trillium, then I will cast a closer eye on those amber waves. And if you stop killing Black children, then I will turn my drums to the sea and away from your wounded mountains. Who mothered your love of death? Here is a heart-shaped stone to rub when you feel fear rising. Give me anything, an empty can of Pabst, a plastic souvenir, a t-shirt from Daytona. Here is a first edition, the complete poems of Lucille Clifton. Give me an ancient grove and a conversation by a creek, charms to solve my griefs, something that says you are human. And I will give you the laughter in my brain and the tranquil eyes of my uncles Show me your grin in the middle of winter. In the 80s, we did the WAP. You too have your dances. It is like stealing light from a flash in the sky. I promise, no one is blaming you. No one is trying to replace you. It's just that you are carrying a tainted clock, calling it European history, standing in khakis, eyes frightened like a mess of beetles. My last poem is titled, Think of Me Laughing. You're right to imagine me sobbing on the corner of 8th Avenue and West 4th, or raising a hashtag cardboard above my head near the Liberty Bell. You're right to picture me lying down below the gold dome Capitol, demanding don't shoot. It is my annual day of sobbing. What are these brown hands for, if not to bury my eyes in the ancient rivers of wrongs? And isn't this my consigned single note in our final piece of music, mindless as a blink? So go ahead. You and I are once again rehearsing decency. It is the dream of loving fruited plains that do not love you back. It is our feet planted in concrete that has me weep. But first, give thought to my luxuries. The sunset I toasted over the Val di Schiana with an aperitivo in Cafe Poliziano the summer of 15. Or give thought to the promontories of conversation with my father yesterday, in which, among other delights, we discussed the dignity of eggplants, whose purplish tint reminded him of a great aunt. Consider my love of celestial bodies. You're better off thinking of me singing this morning, a little Marvin Gaye, not what's going on, but I want you, sultry and soulful, a one-way love is just a fantasy, oh sugar. Forgive me for being bound up in the ecstatic right now. I do not regret my little bout with life. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing those poems with us. It's very much appreciated. I've enjoyed reading The Absurd Man and do have a few questions for you concerning that book of poetry. But first, I was wondering if you could just tell us, what do you enjoy the most about being at UVM, part of UVM?
First and foremost, I would say is the students. They always arrive with a great level of curiosity, and they're immensely talented, and they help me grow in ways that I had not imagined when we first begin the semester. Often there is some evolution that happens with all of us as we embark on areas of study, particularly around language. They keep me up to date on the language of their generation, but also to how they understand and see the world. And that's been one of the great privileges of being a teacher at UVM or being a professor, is you're kind of growing in ways that you had not imagined.
So it sounds like you inspire each other.
We do, and if we contemplate the classroom as more of a laboratory where we're researching the poems that I teach and the poems that they write become an exploration into the human imagination and human experience. And for that reason, we are discovering parts of ourselves. Mm-hmm. None of us have the ongoing script on how to be in this world. And so we are more of a community than me being in front of them as a lecturer. It's, mm-hmm. There's multi dimensions to it.
Well, thank you for that. I do want to read a few questions, if you could answer these for us, about your book, The Absurd Man. Can you share a little more about how the myth of Sisyphus inspired The Absurd Man? Was there an event in your personal life that sparked the idea for Sisyphus as a way to write about one's personal journey to discover the meaning of life?
Sure. I, not so much the figure of Sisyphus, although Sisyphus is crucial. My foray and return to Sisyphus is owed to a book that I read as a young man in high school, and that was The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And in it, Camus speaks about that absurd moment when we reach for meaning and the world is silent. There's something inexplicable, and so much of our journey is marked with how do we reconcile the fact that meaning eludes us. Of course, we find meaning in relationships. We may find meaning in a certain level of spirituality, but for the most part, we return to that place of silence. And so what's crucial to Camus' book is the question of suicide. And he does not recommend suicide as an answer. In fact, he encourages readers to live a fuller life. And he uses Sisyphus as an example. Sisyphus is bound by labor of a rock that he pushes up only for it to fall out and fall back down the mountain, and he has to push it back up as a curse from the gods, of course. Mm-hmm. So he uses this as allegory for existence. And he says at the end of the book, and something that we all have to achieve is we have to imagine Sisyphus happy. We have to imagine him engaged in that labor with a certain kind of joy. And so I have been overwhelmed, and I've been empowered by the human dilemma. And I realized at some point that writing was my way to address meaninglessness, what Robert Frost called stays against confusion. That's how he defined poems. Poems gives us a certain level of insight. Mm-hmm. The Absurd Man, which is the title of the book, references the poet's engagement in that act and search for meaning.
So do you have a favorite poem in The Absurd Man? And how do you characterize your relationship with these poems?
Well, much in the same way, I like this answer. I've stolen it from many other poets, but in a book, it's really hard to say you have a favorite poem, because that's like saying you have a favorite child. And we know how sticky that can be. But there are some poems that I like reading out aloud in the book. And I very much enjoy reading You Reader, which I did not read this morning. And I also very much enjoy Double Major. And I like reading the poems because on some level, I'm returned to that moment of surprise when I wrote it. I often surprise myself and have this internal conversation. And there are moments in which I laugh. Poetry is the highest and most complex form of human speech that is generated by conversations often that the writer has with himself. So Double Major is a fun poem because in it, I am addressing several things there. One, what is the role of poetry, both in relationship to society, but also for the author? On a personal note, there's a moment in the poem in which I mention father and grandfather's dreams and so on. And for me, that dream is freedom, the long march towards freedom in our society. And then there's some, name checking or high-fiving or allusions to Plato, all men are created equal, the Constitution. And so I hope someone is able to kind of connect the dots between, even though it's a poem on one hand that may speak to poetry and the role of poetry, but also the role of poetry in a democratic society.
In The Absurd Man, your poems turn very intimate reflections on the past and close family members who you feel you disappointed. Can you tell us how you use those poems to explore your relationships with your grandmother, mother, and other family members? I know you did mention your grandfather appears twice in the poem, and you shared one of those poems with us. But can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship?
Sure. And thank you for that question. On many levels, I would say our lives are defined by silence. Often when we are most vulnerable with our feelings, we are conditioned to kind of guard ourselves from judgment, possibly. And I found the poems that I'm drawn to, or at least the poets who I read and I count as influential, were fiercely honest. And it was that honesty that satisfied a level of human connection. And frankly, I feel that's one of the reasons why we turn to poetry. And so I almost see it as almost a condition of being a writer of poetry. But there is decency and decorum. We cannot, one has to be artful. One has to find a way of transforming the raw materials of life into authentic expressions. And so I see my poems writing about family, as a means of honoring them. I'm very happy I've written a poem that will allow me years from now and maybe my grandchildren to know what it was like to grow up with my grandfather. But the more vulnerable moments in my life I feel are important to document as well, because there's something about the human journey that is both individual but also emblematic. And if I experienced, say, divorce, which brought a lot of shame, I know many others have as well, and writing about it might give them some measure of comfort and a feeling of being less alone.
And that kind of segues into my next question, which was the poems in The Absurd Man seem to convey, or definitely convey, your personal thoughts and feelings. Do you ever have any hesitation about sharing that vulnerability with your readers, or do you feel that it's more releasing for you?
Yeah, I do have hesitation, but probably less so than my neighbors or other family members. I strongly believe, well, first let me just say, I often do not know when I embark on writing a poem where it's going to go. I'm totally caught up in the rapture of the unknown. And so it does become an exploration, and it does become an exercise in surprising myself, and a foray into the subconscious and all the experiences that help to define me somehow emerge. But also other art, other writers, other thinkers. Do I hesitate? Yes, I do. But I also know that great art is defined by a level of courage to say the unsayable.
Thank you.
Very quickly, a colleague of mine and a friend who I gave the manuscript to called me and said, "Are you sure you want to say this?" And it was great to have someone for whom I could bounce off of, because maybe there are some utterances that do not need to be said or are inappropriate. And we engaged in a conversation one morning and really contemplated the necessity of saying the unsayable. I'll use that phrase again, mainly because it needs to be said, and it's freeing, cathartic, kind of going back to what you were mentioning a second ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's my case, that's what I'll say.
Now, in The Absurd Man, you definitely use Vermont and nature in Vermont in your poems. So what role did your surroundings have on bringing Vermont into your poetry?
18 years after living in the state, it's really difficult not to be caught up in the sublime beauty that is Vermont, and to want to capture it in some form or fashion. Then one realizes that others have done it, like Robert Frost and my friend Mary Ruffo and other poets in our community. It can be a bit of a cliche. And so I'm looking for ways to write about the meadows, the fauna, the flora that strikes me as humane and authentic. But it's definitely been a project of mine for the past decade. I initially was so wedded to my identity as being a poet from Philadelphia, I thought I would lose my street cred if I started writing about the cows and the farms and the snow. But it's just been a wonderful added dimension to my work. And I also say that we are charged by the climate crisis to articulate a connection to the earth that encourages more cherishing. And so my hope is that by writing about the seasons or writing about my hikes in the Green Mountain National Forest, that somehow someone would be inspired to want to preserve and conserve these experiences.
The poem you read earlier, Winter, I believe is the title. When I first read that, I could definitely feel the coldness. I could feel the making of the snow angels and hearing the snowplow go by. So I just wanted to let you know that I definitely felt that one, as being I was born and raised in Vermont and moved to Florida a few years ago, but I do miss the crisp winter mornings because they're so beautiful. So thank you for conveying winter in Vermont through that poem. I so enjoyed.
What's interesting about that? Here's a little secret. I think poems should reach viscerally into the reader's experiences or life memories. And I felt as though I did not have the language, even though I was living in Vermont and I wanted to achieve a level of authenticity. I collect old Vermont life.
Oh, okay.
And I kind of flip through those old Vermont life and will just randomly put my finger down to try and find how have others previously articulated in prose this unique pastoral setting. But also I've been wanting to complicate the image that magazine creates, or that the tourist office creates of Vermont, because I strongly believe that we're moving into an age in which Vermont needs to be seen within a larger global community. And we know that the state has experienced waves of immigrants to arrive here. So I'm both feeding off of that tradition, but also wanting to complicate it and update it into the 21st century.
Very good. So my last question for you has to do with your poem, Double Major. So you write, tragically, he believes he can mend his wounds with poetry. Why tragically? Are there limits to the power of how poetry can heal? And what role do you feel that poetry plays in these unsettled times, like the ones we find ourselves in right now?
Yes. I do not believe there's a limitation to healing. And I believe poetry and all art has helped us through the most trying times. It's why we turn to poetry during the most exalted moments, as well as the most challenging moments.
Mm-hmm.
Wedding poems I'm thinking about, epithalamiums they're called, or elegies when someone passes away. We turn to poetry because we're hurting or we're feeling the ecstatic, and we need the language to express that. So I do not believe there's limitation, but as regards the poet or the absurd man, that poem comes in that section. We only get momentary stays or momentary glimpses into the meaning of life, and then we're back, and we have those epiphanies, those moments of insights. Not that all poetry is for that reason, but best poems give us some insight, some wisdom. But then we're back again to that meaninglessness, and that's the limitation. No one has pure wisdom. If they do, they should start their own religion.
Well, thank you for answering that. Now, Professor, what ideas or inspirations can you offer to those who are interested in writing poetry, whether it be a current UVM student that you have or one of our alumni? If someone would be interested in writing poetry, what advice can you give them?
I have multiple answers, and forgive me, but the first thing I will say is read poetry and read something, make it a passion, make it an avocation, make it a hobby. So read widely and read vertically, read as much as possible. And that's because if you're a writer, I feel as though you want to express something that is unique to yourself, and avoid the cliche, which I believe is the enemy of all good writing. And next I would say is interweave it as part of your daily, your day. And so whether that's in the morning or in the evening or at a break during lunch, either read or write something, like really bring it into your life. And finally, I would say share it with someone, because a poem's reach can really, really, you come to realize how unique and special your relationship and what your words mean to others when you place it in their hands or casually. It doesn't have to be formal, kind of a formal reading, but ask them if they would like to read, and if they say yes, send it to them, and preferably mail it to them. I believe human connection is enriched when we correspond with each other in ways that goes beyond the computer screen. So.
As far as reading poetry, when you're given a book of poetry, I find it difficult to sit and read for an hour of it. I find I have to read a couple of poems and absorb it. Is that how your books are meant to be? I noticed you have segments in your book. So should we read like one segment and then reflect, or read one poem and then reflect?
That's a really good question. And my friend Edward Hirsch has a book. Maybe I'll see if I can get you a copy, called How to Read a Poem.
Oh,
And there is a wonderful, well, there's many passages in there, but what I take from him is poems are really meant to be read one by one.
mm-hmm.
And however, much in the same way that we inherited like the long epic poems that were meant to be read in sections or cantos, you can also approach it that way. But I'm of the mind, read a poem and just let it soak in, just live with it, because it can be overwhelming to read poem after poem. When I first started writing poems, and by the way, my introduction to poetry was my grandparents had 2 books of poetry, Robert Frost and Langston Hughes. And I would just read one poem at a time. I'm talking like age 12,
Mm-hmm.
just read one poem at a time. And I just enjoyed it. It was just like having a little appetizer. You know?
Very true.
Question.
Well, Major, thank you for joining us this morning. It's very much appreciated. And to the audience, I hope that you enjoyed this event as well, and that it has inspired you to reflect on the impact that your UVM faculty members have had on your lives. Now, copies of Major Jackson's book, The Absurd Man, are available through the UVM bookstore, as well as at all major book retailers. Thank you so much. Next, please join us for the virtual live Andrew Harris Commons Legacy Breakfast as we gather to honor the legacy and work of UVM community members who have led the way in inspiring and in strengthening diversity, equity, and inclusion on the UVM campus. The program will include special remarks by Dr. Wanda Heading Grant, UVM's Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Bev Colston, Director of the Mosaic Center for Students of Color. The event will conclude with the dedication of the Black Lives Matter flag. This concludes our program. Thank you all for joining us.